I am thrilled to have Daniel Hearsch, Managing Director at AlixPartners. He is going to talk about supply chain today, and we're going to discuss the coronavirus. So, thank you for coming on the show, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, Noah. Really glad to be here.
Great. So, first, just give us your background real quick, so people know where you're coming from.
Sure. So I grew up in Detroit, long history working in the automotive industry for both OEMs and tier one, tier two suppliers. Since going into consulting, I've primarily worked in procurement and supply chain roles and projects. I've taken a number of interim leadership roles. Most recently, I was the global director of purchasing for a tier one auto supplier with significant global operations. Yeah, I mean, fairly well versed in all things purchasing and supply chain, typically in discrete manufactured goods areas.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I saw an article where you were quoted in industry news,
hmm
and everybody's. It seems like every day people are talking about Corona even more and more, and I I thought, all right, well, we should talk to somebody about it.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that a lot of people have been talking to you about this.
Yeah, it's a hot topic, right? And of course, rightfully so. You compare people like to compare this version, this COVID-19, this coronavirus to SARS, which was the last really major outbreak where it was a significant epidemic in Asia and other parts of the world. Big differences are China at that time was roughly 4% of global GDP,
And
and
what
today
year? What year was that?
what was that? Circa 2003, I believe.
Okay, yeah, totally
So
different world.
yeah, right. I mean, the exposure to China in the global supply chain was just significantly different, as well as China's own internal economy. The amount of material that is manufactured and consumed there today is much more significant. So, the impact on global supply chains is still a big deal. The impact on China's economy, China's manufacturing is really the bigger story. I suspect most of your listeners are more interested in getting materials, getting components, getting parts out of China. And now, of course, they should be thinking about other areas than China. Italy and Korea have become the current worry beads, areas of concern. And so, those are parts of the world where machining, manufacturing, steel parts, a significant supply base exists in those areas. And so, yeah, I think one of the hardest things about this is just not being able to know how it's going to impact operations, what the local response is going to be. I mean, we've seen what China did, and by all indications, the government and businesses there, shutting down, limiting exposure, limiting travel, keeping people, frankly, quarantined and away from each other seems to have been the right thing, the right type of response, and that is certainly how you control
Right.
a disease like this.
Of
But
course, we don't know if what they're telling us is true and what isn't.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's always that. I mean, China's always had that criticism, the feeling, and I'll tell you where my information comes from. Our partners that are located in China, boots on the ground, kind of give us a daily briefing on what they're seeing from the government and what we're seeing in real time from the companies that we're working with there.
okay.
It does, grain of salt, and that's not a knock on the Chinese government. Frankly, it's a knock on any type of government and any type of communication
Our
like this.
government would never tell us anything.
Sure. I mean,
No.
there's always messaging. You always want to control panic, but yeah, I mean, just not being able to know how this is really going to impact businesses, how it's going to impact people. You have to some degree, just just take trust in the numbers. I mean, it's great news that the incidence of new cases, that deaths seem to be falling. I mean, that the human story there is positive. That also gives you some hope that that business will get back on track relatively soon. Of course, the worst thing you could do is try and get ahead of this and get people back to work too soon, because then people start getting sick again. And so you
Right. I
do
was
want,
reading that, like, somebody, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, they were saying the problem is if you send people back to a factory and then one person has it, then you
yeah,
have to close down again, and that's even
quite possible.
worse.
Yeah, I mean, it would potentially start all over again. Now, there are kind of two aspects to this. From a personnel, from a personal standpoint, not personal for me, but from a humanitarian standpoint, this outbreak couldn't have happened at a worse time, because at Lunar New Year, so many people travel in such tight quarters, that the exposure, that's a big part of why the exposure was more widespread and why people were so affected by it.
Because they're
From
traveling
a
within China, so it's spreading
Yes,
all from the cities to the countryside.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, massive numbers of people commute during that period across the country in some cases, and it's different in different areas. Some provinces have a much more local, stable workforce than others. But yeah, now on the business side, it couldn't have happened at a better time. I mean, that's one of the few things that you can pick for a bright side is coming up on the Lunar New Year. Everyone that would be buying goods coming out of China was planning for, an
Vacation.
8-day shutdown, right?
An 8 day
Everybody
shutdown.
knows. Yeah, I mean, everybody knows Lunar New Year is 8 days. A year or two in advance when it's going to be, how long are people going to be gone, and so a company that's maybe in the automotive aftermarket or some other similar, less planned than automotive industry, they will have gotten extra safety stock, at least on the water, right? Everybody's scrambling in November, December to make sure their orders are in, make sure everything's going to be made, make sure it's on a boat in time to get out before the Lunar New Year. And so there was more material in warehouses in transit than there otherwise might have been if this popped up, in the middle of July.
Mm-hmm.
But at the back end, nobody was expecting an extra 8 to 12 days, which is what we saw, right? And in some cases, there are still factories that are down. Now, when we're
So
talking
some
about
of the
Western,
factories have opened up that were down.
the majority of factories that were down have opened up. There are still some that are that won't open till March. I had some notes here. I think it's 41 41% of factories. So this is a Chinese government survey of roughly 1,000 companies, 982 enterprises. 41% had resumed by February 14th, which was kind of the end of the Hubei province shutdown. The 10th was the other provinces. 41% expected to be up by the end of the month, which is this week. The remaining 17%.
By the way, everybody, this is February 26th right now. So
that's correct. Yeah.
This is supposed to come out in, actually not for, wasn't going to come out for 2.5 weeks. So who knows?
Okay.
This whole thing could be way outdated.
Yeah. I was going to say you might want to bring that forward, because this would be so dynamic. By the time this comes out, we'll be talking about other countries and other impacts. But yeah, at this point, as we sit today at the end of February,
We'll see. Maybe I can rush it. We'll see.
it could be. But yeah, 80+% should be back to work now. That's open. The bigger issues that you have are around transportation and workforce, right? So there are still significant numbers of people that are either quarantined due to travel, unable to get back because the transportation networks are down, or just frankly afraid to travel. And so what I'm understanding is a lot of companies are running it at suboptimal capacity, 30, 40% of what they would like to be. One statistic that one index that the Chinese government is watching is electricity usage, right? To get a broad-based view of manufacturing, you can look at how much electricity was used in, say, 2018 and 2019 during the same period post-Lunar New Year. And then they're looking at what does it look like now. and it's about 57% of the level, right? So we're less than 60% of activity by that
than
metric
a year ago.
than a year ago and the year before. So yeah, the chart's really interesting. In
Wow.
2018 and 2019, it's kind of a line that craters into the Lunar New Year, comes up pretty quickly. Within a couple weeks is really back to nominal, back to an index of 100. And then the line for 2020 is just this practically flat, low slope
So
um,
you
recovery.
okay. Well, you said in industry news, I read you saying 30 to 40 days we'll see the parts shortages hit.
Yeah.
Um, is that the same forecast now? So that was 30 to 40 days from from February 14th. So you're talking March, mid
Yeah,
March.
sure. I mean, that's very much a bit of a, estimate, and it will be some will come earlier, right? And it's very industry influenced, right? So, and when I say that, what I mean is in automotive, we have very lean supply chains. We don't keep
Right.
large amounts of material in warehouses or in transit. We rely on a lot of transparency, a lot of shared information to make sure that if I'm running a car plant, I don't have to keep 6 weeks of safety stock. I know exactly where everything is, and so industries like that rely on just in time, just in sequence manufacturing are going to be affected much sooner than, say, automotive aftermarket companies that are more, B2B, B2C type sellers that have a lot more volatility of demand, less ability to plan. Their forecasts aren't as good or in their control. And so they tend to have larger safety stocks. And so they'll have planned differently. They'll have had more material on the water, or they'll have had more material at the supplier that they can quickly deploy.
Yeah.
And then there are others that are simply have pretty fat supply chains, and it will take longer for them to work through all of the excess material. But at the end of the day, these shutdowns have been the pure shutdown was the 8 to 12 extra days. But the time it's taking, we're almost a month after the end of the planned Lunar New Year. And what did we say? We're at 50% of the capacity, 57% of the capacity that we would have expected, given a normal
So,
recovery.
so you said that just now that stuff is coming back. It's opening. I was reading that like Hyundai and Nissan, they're in China. They're totally closed down.
Yeah, some of those plants, particularly in Hubei, closer to ground zero for the outbreak, are still through March, closed down. I wrote this down, but now I'm
But
not
you
seeing it in my
think,
notes.
based on your sources, they will
Well,
reopen?
yeah, they'll open eventually. So the reasons for their shutdown, I'm not sure, and I'm sure they haven't published why. So either they're considering parts shortages or people shortages, or possibly, and probably more likely, they're just taking into account their workforce and want the workforce to get well, make sure that bringing them back to work is not going to create a resurgence of the epidemic and shut them down further, right? So it's a bit of an abundance of caution, but those are primarily those Nissan Dongfang and others in that area are the ones that are closest to where the outbreak happened. They're the most affected. Their supply chains are probably relatively short, meaning they have relatively local suppliers. And so, they may simply be thinking, listen, we could open up. We're still not going to be able to get all the parts we need. And, one thing to remember is there's no degree of importance where one part is more important than another. If I don't have every bolt
Uh
and
huh.
nut and transmission, I can't build the car, right? So I've got to have everything. And so they're
Interesting.
most likely focusing on assessing the supply chain problems, uh, triaging and then addressing them, so putting them in the right priority, and then deciding, okay, what's the right thing to do? We could bring people back to work if we're not going to have enough parts to make cars. What's the point? let's just wait this thing out. And so that's
Well,
I think you're seeing that. But those are a couple of plants out of the hundreds that are in China.
okay. Well, I mean, obviously you can't predict the future,
No.
but should our American listeners, European, um, what should we be preparing for? Are we preparing for higher demand for our parts? Are they going to be covering for the stuff that they're not getting in China? Should they be buying more machines, perhaps, or
So the first question, yeah, there's a good possibility, if not for probably not to supply the China market, but particularly with machine parts that are not at quite as reliant on hard tooling, like castings or things like that. Something where you can program and relatively quickly get a part tooled up and the process
right?
kind of finalized and made. Yeah, there's every indication that between not being able to get the parts out of China and now Italy and Korea also big steel machining centers. A lot of parts supply out of those. U.S. companies or North American companies, frankly, are likely to want to shorten their supply chains. They're going to want to work with companies that are more local that you can
What
work in real time, right? So
what
yeah,
about
there's
turning? What about turning companies?
yeah, I think the same. I think that all of those. I
They
mean,
can they could the people who can set up their machines, maybe they
right,
were running these jobs a couple years ago and now
sure.
they can put them back on. You see that as a definite possibility.
Yes, and now what I would say is I don't know that I would advise anyone to be going out to buy machines themselves, but certainly things that you can get more quick. I mean, you're talking about adding capacity to fix a situation that may only be 6 months or a year, right? So is your threshold to pay off a machine 6 months or a year? Probably not, right? Not certainly not a brand new machine. Now maybe used
Right.
equipment, possibly, right? But at the same time, if this could have happened, there's nothing good about this epidemic. Let's be clear. But the the auto market in China has been down over the past couple of years. It was set for some recovery this year. The U.S. auto market is going to be down this year. Europe's been flat, and so capacity should not be a problem, right?
Mm.
Capacity to make parts really shouldn't be a problem. So adding capacity will be a very individual company by company decision based on how much you have and what types of things you can or want to do. Right now, we do not have the downstream problem that China has, meaning if a Nissan plant is closed and I supply that plant but I'm open because my plant is up in Chongqing or someplace that wasn't really affected. I still don't have anything to make because my customer is not taking parts. That's
Mm-hmm.
not true for the U.S. right now. Right now, the U.S. plants, the U.S. consumers are still making and buying as needed, right? So we have a supply problem for the U.S. We don't have a demand problem yet. Now,
What?
if
Yeah.
all the fears come true and we have to start having similar shutdowns in the U.S., then we'll
Yeah.
have a downstream problem, and that becomes a different problem to solve.
Well, okay. So it hasn't happened here. Say it doesn't happen here, but we know it's happening in Italy right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And of course, we don't know what the heck is happening, but some
Yeah.
factories are shutting down.
Sure.
So how has that changed your? Um, and I'm probably the 10th person that's asked you that in the
Yeah.
last
Right.
2 days. So
Uh,
what's the
well,
latest your latest analysis?
yeah. Well, so the way to address these problems, these are not new things, right? So this coronavirus, yes, this is the new problem today, but there are large scale issues like these that have happened before. A great example that most people remember is the tsunami that hit Japan in what
Ah,
2011, right? That caused widespread damage, shutdowns of power grids, and it really impacted companies in two ways. One, companies that were too concentrated in their supply chain, and two, that didn't have backup suppliers or plan Bs and plan Cs, right? And so coming out of that, there was a lot of work by most companies that were in business in diversifying their supply chains, either by having multiple suppliers or making sure that they didn't have everything in one region, but also, even if you didn't tool up a second company, knowing who are my 3 or 4 other companies that I can go to quickly, right? So when I help a client quote something out, we don't just decide on the final person who gets the business and then throw out all that information. It's you develop relationships with the 2 or 3 that were really good suppliers, so that if something like this happens, you go, okay, my guy in China is shut down. I need to go back to this guy who was my second best quote and then find out
But the
what's it
problem is
take.
this is everywhere, and we don't know where it's going next. It's not just like one country.
Yeah, no, that's true. But right now it's really it's serious in 3 countries. We don't know how it
That would
will.
be China, Korea, and Italy.
Try China, South Korea, and Italy. That's exactly right.
What about Japan?
Japan has not announced. I mean, I think there's been one death, but I don't believe we've seen any kind of large issue or any type of shutting down. Like Venice shutting down Carnival. That's a pretty good indication of how serious that they thought that was, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean you've
Well,
got
plus it's a lot of internationals, so
right,
that's
people traveling.
that's the crazy. The whole thing is kind of getting my croc brain going, like
Yeah.
because next week, as we said, but there's probably going to be something totally different. That what about? I was listening to sort of a doom and gloom podcast this morning on the way to work, and they were. I know you're not. This isn't your specialty, but have you talked to people about like the medical industry? And I know like lots of the generic drugs are made, like 90%. They said on there 90% of generic drugs are made there, and heparin is made there. And what's the talk on that stuff?
It's similar. Those are manufactured goods at the end of the day, and the supply of whether it's raw materials into the country, within the country, the plants running. Those are all the same types of issues as manufactured. Those tend to be more continuous process. So once they're up and running, they're typically less labor intensive, even in a country like China. But yeah, the transportation issue is going to be a big deal. At minimum, if they can get the manufacturing up and running again, and I'm not up to speed on whether those plants are running or where the centers of excellence or centers of manufacturing for some pharmaceuticals are in China. I don't know if they're in Wuhan or as far from Wuhan as possible, but that's an important part of this. But regardless, the shipping, it's going to add a lot of cost. So the question of availability is one. The question of whether there are cost hits in the short term is another. I'm not actually terribly familiar with how they ship drugs, whether they always air freight them for age purposes or whether they could spoil on the ocean. If they already air freight them, then there probably isn't a big concern. If it is typically ocean shipping is getting, when we talk about that 30 to 40 day thing, that's the next big deal, right? You've got a lot of ships sitting doing nothing. That's capacity that is lost capacity.
So wait, why are they sitting doing nothing? Because they're not filled up?
Because there's nothing to make. Nobody's making anything, so there's nothing to ship. The parts that left China already, those ships are getting, what is it, 23, 28 days to get from China to the U.S. It's only about 19 or 20 to get to Europe, right? So they're there. They're getting there within a week or two, and then a trip back. But there's no new parts coming, right? So the ships that were already on their way back to China to get their next load, they're going to get there, and there's nothing to move, or the amount of. So the one data point is liquid containers, tanker ships. Those rates are down 80%. Right. So now
So why are people using airplanes now? I mean, I read people are using airplanes to fly over stuff. Is that because there aren't enough ships to do it? So
No. There's plenty of ships. It's so if you think of it like this, I'm ordering one container per week, right? Let's say I'm just getting one container of stuff per week. It goes on a ship, and I've been doing that for a year. So every week I've got a container, and so at any given time, I've got 4 containers on the ocean because it takes 4 weeks to get from the port in China to the port in LA. Right now, stop shipping for 4 weeks. What do I need to do? I need to get 4 containers to me very quickly. The only way to do that then is to air freight, because if I don't have those 4 weeks of containers sitting in inventory safety stock someplace, then I have to expedite my shipment in order to get my supply chain filled up. Right? It's just like getting an air bubble in a pipe. Right? So you're trying to push water through the pipe, and as long as the water's just flowing, it's no problem. All of a sudden, I've got an air bubble. If I need the water there, then I have to get the only way to get it there faster is to bypass the bubble, right? So that's what
Right.
the air freight is like.
That's what I kind of figured. Okay, so it's
Yeah,
bypassing the
that's right.
boats that aren't coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so as far as the science of it all,
hmm
I mean, I'll admit it. I don't totally get it. I somebody told me today that, like, if somebody breathes on something or coughs on something, it can actually stay on an object for 24 hours or something. Is that true, or is that BS?
No, a coronavirus is a fairly common type of virus, as by my understanding. That the common cold is a type of coronavirus. It's that this particular version of it seems to be very contagious and has a relatively high fatality rate. Right? It's somewhere close 2.5 to 3% of people that get it seem to die. Compare that with I think it's 0.5 or 0.05% for the flu, right? So far more people get the flu, far fewer people as a percentage die from it, right? But this is the type of virus that does not last for a long time on dry surfaces, right? So the wisdom or the science seems to be limiting interpersonal contact and washing your hands, right? These are the two best ways to avoid this virus. And my wife's a nurse, so we talk about this quite a bit. Wearing a mask is somewhat effective, but mistakes people make are that they wear the mask for multiple days, right? That is a 1 day device.
Oh,
There
really?
often people are not. Oh yeah, people are not wearing the right type of mask, right? So these viruses are very small particles. And then the other thing is you don't. If you're wiping your eyes, if you're touching something that does have the virus on it, and how long this particular virus can last on a dry surface, I don't know. I'm not sure if they know yet. I'm not sure if the scientists have figured that out, and if they have, I just haven't read that part of the news. But let's say somebody sneezes in the air and it lands on a desk or lands on a handrail in an airport, and then you touch it and you wipe your face. Well, that's typically how people are getting these diseases. And so that's why this interpersonal contact, limiting travel. This is why this is an effective way to stem the epidemic, and seems to have been
Right.
fairly effective. But it's also why it was such a problem to have it happen at Lunar New Year when everybody
And you can have it and don't know you have it, and that's the really scary thing. Like, if
That's
everybody
another.
who had it,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
coughed
People
up
can be
blood,
asymptomatic.
then you would be fine. But
Yeah, that's right. There are a number of people that are asymptomatic, that don't have a fever, that maybe just think they have a cold, and honestly, it's not always easy to tell the difference between this virus and a simple cold virus. If you look at the history of this news cycle, there was a period a week or two ago where all of a sudden the number of reported cases spiked by a couple thousand in a day, and it wasn't that the rate of infection went up, it was the rate of detection went up. They started being able to
ah,
detect the disease and determine, and part of the evidence of this was not only did the number of cases go up, it was the number of reported deaths, and it was people that had died in the prior weeks that were just now getting a different test. So it's the detection of the virus that has also changed, but now it really seems to have come back down, if we can believe everything we're being told.
Sure, and we can't. But
Oh,
I don't consider myself a big conspiracy theorist. But
mhm.
what? Okay, just a few like, and again, I'm not don't expect you to be Nostradamus or anything, but like, say there is some quarantining in somewhere in the United States, and
Mhm.
some things start shutting down.
Sure.
Um, then what's going to happen to the supply chain? Is everything here going to just stop, or
Um,
is that just a stupid, impossible question?
no, no. I mean, listen, it would likely look very much like China in that case. There would be so what's happened there? If we had the same type of thing, we had an outbreak, and the CDC or the U.S. government decided the way that we're going to address this is a quarantine, which means nobody's going to school, people shouldn't go to work. The impact to the U.S. should be quite a bit less. Why? Because we're less of a manufacturing economy than China is in relative terms, right? So my ability to work remotely is significantly higher on a per capita basis, right? So
Interesting. Okay.
now, in large terms, as a percentage of GDP, I'm not even sure that's true, but in the sense that uh, we are typically much better able to do our jobs from home, from someplace remote. Like I'm currently in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I don't live here. I'm at a client. I travel, but I wouldn't have to, right? I
Right.
could still do a lot of my work. I could converse with people much like you and I are right now, and still be pretty effective. Not perfectly effective, but it will certainly cause a dent. It will
Well,
certainly
but the people listening to this,
mhm.
they're the people with the
Yeah,
factories, and so
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. No,
it's.
I mean, that's a risk, right? That's
I mean, if it happens in California,
mhm.
um, then is that going to like drastically? It would drastically affect somebody in Detroit, right?
It could. I mean, certainly there. I have suppliers in California for with some of my clients. They buy machine parts. I have clients that are Dallas based that have plants in California that make aftermarket motorcycle parts. Right. Those would certainly be affected.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the statistics out of that same Chinese government study that I'd read, 42% of those so we remember 1,000 enterprises or 982 enterprises were asked these questions. 42% of those enterprises will run out of cash in 3 months, and 10% of them will run out of cash in 1 month. So if you have companies,
Repeat that again.
so out of the 982 enterprise, again, these are
In China.
Chinese companies in
Okay.
China, right? So that we're talking about this as a corollary to what could happen. They still have to pay salaries, they still have to pay rent, they still have to pay fixed overhead. There are fixed costs that they still have to pay. Those 42% of those companies that were surveyed would run out of cash if this continued for 3 months, and 10% will run out of cash, which means ostensibly here it would mean bankruptcy or having to borrow more money, I guess. But if you don't have cash flow coming in, and you've got all your fixed costs, which may include labor and salaries and other things, you've got a cash flow problem, right? And so that's one of the aspects that, if you're thinking about just being somewhat prudent, you should probably secure some type of line of credit before it becomes a bigger problem. You should probably, I'm not saying go borrow money, but make it available, right? These are the types of things that being proactive in your business, you should be thinking about to some degree. The health and safety of your workers should absolutely be paramount. But you also have to protect for the business in order for them to be.
What will happen if these companies in China go belly up?
Uh, you know, uh, I think the common wisdom is they will get help. Some of them, now it really depends. Are they state-owned enterprise or state managed enterprises? They will get treated differently than a purely foreign-owned or a joint venture type of enterprise.
But they'll keep
Um,
going.
Yeah,
somehow
yes,
the government will keep them going.
that is what history would tell you, right? That is typically what would happen. There, now the insurance coverages and things have really changed. A lot of companies have started to exclude epidemics as a force majeure or as a reason for coverage. And so, the implication, some of the legal and financial implications of these shutdowns are really dependent on how your contracts are written. So some will get help from insurance, some will get help from the government, some may fail. Some may go into a bank, and I honestly, I work for a company that are experts in bankruptcy. I don't personally know how bankruptcy works in China. I
Yeah.
don't know what the framework is there.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, what is, and I'm putting you in a terrible position here, but like,
Mm-hmm.
what's the best case scenario from today, from February 26th? A conservative best case scenario, and what is a worst case scenario for the next I don't know, 2-3 months?
A best case scenario is that Italy and Korea get things under control, that countries that are proximal to them take the right steps and keep this from really becoming a global pandemic, and that people get back to work, and within at this rate it looks like another 4 to 5 months anyway before things are really back up to speed. But then you would expect to see somewhat of an acceleration for some of those businesses that are catching up for the missed demand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you may see some government intervention, kind of like what we saw back in 2001 here in the United States, keep America rolling types of things. The Chinese
Yeah.
government, Chinese enterprises could certainly do the same thing. China's auto industry was on its way to a bit of a recovery this year. And so that's probably derailed. You're going to see single digit percentage impacts to global GDP, like stock market and everything else in China and the US are going to take some pain in the short term. Worst case is the worst case. It's the zombie apocalypse. I mean, if you really wanted to get crazy with it, but no, I mean it could. Worst case would be that it continues to spread, that people and governments don't take it seriously, that we allow it to jump off into new areas and cause more shutdowns. That would
Are we
really be the worst case.
overreacting?
Um, it doesn't feel like it right now, but this is one of those things time will tell. I think most people would agree you'd much rather overreact with something like this. I mean, these are people. These are people's lives, and the long term is much more important than short term business gains. Right?
Sure.
It's much more important that we consider the people in this. Because that's not just a purely humanitarian view. That's good
It's a
business.
business thing. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good business view, and so that's the type of thing. But companies should be planning for these contingencies. There, and you don't have to plan for every contingency. Just the most reasonable, 2 or 3, which you have to assess what is your likely impact if certain of your customers do go down, or if some of your supply is likely to be constrained or disrupted. What can you do to get back on track as quickly as possible? What can you do to avoid a problem before you see it coming? So if you are somewhat exposed to Europe, are there if you've been avoiding switching for some reason, and you have viable suppliers in North America or other parts of the world, you should probably be talking to them and at least getting the conversation going. The sooner, the earlier ahead of that you are, the better off you're likely to
Yeah.
be, even if you don't end up needing it.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Uh,
Thank you.
I'm. I feel like every day I'm becoming slightly less secure. Hopefully that'll change. It all depends on who you read and
Yeah,
etc.
yeah, for sure. That's certainly
Like
true.
we had some machines that we were like really excited to buy, and then now it looks like maybe we won't be able to buy them, and I'm starting to think maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Could be.
But
Ooh,
man plans, God laughs.
that's right. That's right. The best laid plans, as they say.